Good afternoon. Can I bring this meeting to order? I'm Belinda Gurgle, and I serve on the board of the Charleston Literary Festival, and on behalf of all of our board, let me welcome you today to what is going to be a very powerful session. I have the pleasure today of introducing our panel. But before I do that, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors for today's session, Judy and Bernard Cornwell. Panelists and audience, the Cornwells know firsthand the incredible power of books and literature to foster new understandings and connections in our society. And so we say thank you for your continued support of this festival. And now, I want everyone to reach down and get your seatbelt, and let's buckle it up, because we're going to have quite a ride for the next hour. Today's program, Press and Palace, features Tina Brown and Betsy Prioleau with Amanda Foreman. Tina Brown is an author, journalist, and an editor. She is the former editor-in-chief of Tatler, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. She's the founding editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast. She is the author of the Diana Chronicles, the Vanity Fair Diaries, and most recently, the Palace Papers. Betsy Prioleau is an author, a professor, and a cultural historian. She is a former English professor at Manhattan College, and she has taught cultural history at NYU. She is the author of 4 books: Circle of Eros, Sexuality in the Work of William Dean Howells, Seductress, Women Who Ravished the World and Their Lost Art of Love, Swoon, Great Seducers and Why Women Love Them, and most recently, Diamonds and Deadlines, a tale of greed and conceit and a female tycoon in the Gilded Age. Guiding our discussion today is Dr. Amanda Foreman, an award-winning historian whose book, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, has been made into a television documentary, a radio play starring Dame Judi Dench, and an Oscar-winning film. Her second book, A World on Fire, has won numerous awards, and she also wrote the BBC Two series, The Ascent of Women. Amanda has a new book in progress, The World Made by Women, A History of Women from the Apple to the Pill. So, let me remind you before we get started that books mentioned in this program can be purchased in the lobby, and we hope you will purchase them here today. So I'm going to take my seat. Amanda, I'm turning it over to you, okay?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be sitting here in this beautiful place, and we're thrilled to be part of the Charleston Literary Festival, and thank you very much for having us all. And I know it is also rather amazing to have 2 such accomplished women coming at the subject of the power of women from completely opposite ends of the spectrum, and yet somehow managing to arrive in the center. And I'm going to begin by talking to Betsy, because there's something about your book which is absolutely mesmerizing. And so, but in order to frame its true genius, I'm going to ask you just to give the audience a quick summation of the beginnings of your career, because I think that why you wrote Diamonds and Deadlines was already, as it were, a nugget in your first book, The Circle of Eros, which is really about William Dean Howells and his sexuality and how he figured himself out and his sexuality through his novels. So what is it, briefly, that is your guiding principle about the power of sex and sexuality to be an engine, sort of the engine in somebody's life? You can just...
Yeah, the fascinating thing is that both of these books are about a period of high prudery in America. So that when you talk about sexuality in the Victorian American period, you're talking about an underground substrata in the country. So for William Dean Howells, this was a man raised as extremely phobic about sexuality. And he worked through his novels to a healing process. He understood at the end that sexuality was a positive force. It was the eros in our lives. And that led me to women's sexuality and the fact that it had been so severely repressed during that period. So then that led to Seductress, which is a misleading title, actually, because this is about women who were successful in their personal, vocational, and erotic lives. And I saw that this had been sort of a degraded art form because it had just been misunderstood for years, maybe through patriarchy, I don't know. But that led in turn to a woman, Mrs. Frank Leslie, who ran the largest publishing company in America and was tremendously influential and powerful during her time as a tastemaker and everything else. What fascinated me was that during that time, she was able to live as what they called in those days a free luster. That is to say, she was able to have lovers without guilt, 4, almost 5 husbands, a 10-year ménage à trois with 2 men. And to me, this was all very intriguing because it added to her empowerment in her work and in her life instead of detracting from it. How she got away with it, that's another story.
That's right. So you have this particular theory, which I find absolutely fascinating, which is that a truly powerful woman is a woman who is able to own her own sexuality, live in it, be with it, use it as she wants, and, as it were, have it all. But now we come to the heroine of Diamonds and Deadlines, this young woman called Miriam Foreman. And she's this illegitimate girl from New Orleans in the mid-19th century, and then she ultimately transforms herself into one of the richest women, most successful publishers in America. And in a way, it seems to me that she's like a kind of interesting cross between Eva Peron, Kim Kardashian, and Joseph Pulitzer, you know, kind of all kind of like wrapped up into one. But in your book, what you describe is somebody who had the grimmest of childhood. So let's set the scene and describe what was this terrible, terrible beginning that she had.
Yeah, well, she portrayed herself as an aristocratic woman from a Louisiana plantation, but the truth is much, much, much drearier, and she really had a hard-knocked, disheveled background. First of all, she was born illegitimate in 1836, almost certainly the daughter of one of the enslaved women her father brought from Charleston to New Orleans. She grew up in dire poverty, and her father was a bankrupt, absentee, and his common-law wife, Susan, kept a boarding house for men, no questions asked. This was a euphemism for a brothel. After that, Miriam and this quote-unquote mother, Susan, lived a pillar-to-post life, and they finally ended up in New York. Her only means of support dried up there, and she was forced to take up prostitution. So she attended what they called public balls then. This is where you picked up men, where she was, quote, well up in the market, and she basically, rose from this position of a streetwalker, moving up through one man after another until she finally became mistress to a married Tennessee congressman. and then he bought her a townhouse in New York, and then she managed to snag a well-known anthropologist at a popular trysting ground, which was near the townhouse.
But I have to interrupt you here because it gets even better. So, along with Mrs. Frank Leslie as she became, there's another woman who was also probably one of the most successful, notorious adventurers in the 19th century, a woman called Lola Montez, who figures all over the world because she had an affair with the King of Bavaria, she did this, she did that, and ended up in the US. So she's quite a girl for someone who was born in Ireland, and in similarly unfortunate circumstances, and renamed herself Lola Montez. But here's the kicker, that it's thanks to Lola Montez that Miriam Foreman, and the way they met is extraordinary. So can you just describe that? Because it just...
You can't make this stuff up.
Literally.
You really can't. Miriam's half-brother committed suicide over Lola Montez. And to atone, Lola adopted Miriam as her sister and trained her for the stage in an East Coast tour, and included in these lessons in acting. And this is what made Miriam, I think, such a successful businesswoman, was her phenomenal training in the theater. Lola trained her in the theater, but included lessons in seduction. Lola Montez had just written a book on the arts of fascination and that sort of thing. So they went on the East Coast tour, and Miriam was highly praised wherever she went. And the curious thing is, she was always playing an aristocrat or a woman who was a quote, in those days, mulatto, which is curious because that's exactly what she probably was. At any rate, all was going well. Lola had willed everything she owned to Miriam, which was a great deal. Lola had accumulated many, many jewels. And then on tour, Lola, who had converted to a more puritanical lifestyle, shall we say, caught Miriam entwined with the married Tennessee congressman and summarily fired and disinherited her. So that was the beginning of Miriam's adventures with the married Tennessee congressman, which then led, as I said, on a horizontal path up.
Well, so it is kind of, yes, that's a horizontal path up. That's kind of fantastic. So then she catches this rather revolting man, to be honest, E.G. Squeers.
Yes.
Who's a kind of anthropologist and amazingly unattractive. And in every way, as a human being, as well as just in looks, as far as I can tell. And but tell us how she manages to both keep him dangling while she then goes after his boss, Frank Leslie, and captures Frank Leslie, because that's again you just can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary story. E.G. Square was a peculiar individual, and I think his sexuality was a bit ambiguous. He preferred women with a tinge of color, but he also had an attraction to native, this is again a quote, native boys. And when I was researching the book, I read his novel. He wrote a homoerotic novel about his adventures in Peru. So he was obviously a little fluid, let's put it that way. But he married Miriam, and almost immediately she found herself in a bad situation because he was highly patriarchal and believed in female obedience. He wanted a housekeeper and that sort of thing. But Miriam managed to get a job with Frank Leslie. His editor of the ladies' magazine had just died, and he needed a new editor. So a romance then bloomed, and Frank Leslie left his wife and 2 children. And since he was a real power player in the journalistic world and was quite wealthy at the time, he was able to afford a house for them. And in that way, a ménage à trois began, because he said, look, I have a house, I can pay for it. He was then in love with Miriam, so he arranged the house so there were adjoining bedrooms. Poor E.G., as he was then called, he was consigned to the hall on a couch, and there were stolen weekends that the lovers took, and so on. Finally, E.G. went off to Peru for a year, and while he was there, then Miriam and Frank Leslie were a couple. They went everywhere together, they traveled, they did everything. But then when E.G. came back, he didn't have a penny, so he was forced then to live with them as kind of a, he was a kind of a unpaid servant there, except that he didn't do any of the housework. So eventually, it got so disagreeable that Miriam decided she would take matters in her own hands. So she set up this elaborate adultery sting. Because she had beautiful connections in the press, hired 2 illustrators to invite E.G. to a grand dinner at what turned out to be a Temple of Venus, as they were then called. And E.G. went to this dinner, and Gypsy and Indiana, the two professionals who took him in charge, fed him a fantastic dinner and lots of punch and Madeira and that sort of thing, led him upstairs, and after half an hour, the illustrators went upstairs and took out their drawing equipment and sketched him nude on the chair with the 2 nude women at his feet. That was all Miriam needed, because a woman, in order to get a divorce, needed to have concrete proof. And it was very difficult for a woman then to do that. Never mind that there was a stigma. So after that, poor E.G., by New York law then, was not permitted to ever marry again. He was able to get his revenge later, but that's another part of the story.
So they get married, the 2 Leslies, and they're now the most powerful publishing media couple in the country. And what's kind of fascinating, though, is that Frank Leslie had been a protege of P.T. Barnum. So you have these 2 extraordinary figures who have both been proteges of kind of adventurers themselves, who are somehow able to kind of plug in to the zeitgeist and know exactly what the people want. And do you think that, is that something that can be made, or are you born with that kind of instinct? And what is it that, I mean, because they could do it, right? They between them.
This is where Tina comes in.
Yeah, but we're focusing on you right now. So between them, though, they managed to literally own the kind of mid-market of American media.
Yes. Oh, Frank Leslie was a genius. He came from England and he apprenticed with Barnum, and they went all over the country together. So he learned to have a clairvoyant sense of what people want. And what people wanted then was visual drama. And he produced that. He began as an engraver. So that's how he was able to pull people. He also had a motto, never shoot over the heads of the people. So he played to their interest and spicy stories and exposés. He was really a pioneer in that.
And what was Lola doing? Oh, sorry, what was Miriam doing?
And Miriam had this same instinct. She was able to scope out markets before her competitors were able to grasp what that audience wanted and needed. For example, her first job, the reason she succeeded so brilliantly was she took over this magazine called it was called the Ladies Magazine. And this is 1863, at the time when the Civil War was just going through the most dismal, gruesome time. And before she took over, there were all these stories about the war and how people were coping and all that. She was too smart for that. She said, people don't want that. They want escape. So she took over the magazine and she then said, this is the year, this was the worst year of the war, this is the year of fashions. And she started a new column, what should and should not be worn.
During the war.
During the war. And more brilliantly than that, she made herself a model for the kinds of clothes that should be worn. And she got these samples free, of course, from designers, and usurped the role of fashion arbiter from the other two women's magazines. It was really quite a brilliant move.
So there she is. She's at the pinnacle of her success. And then this is where I think she really becomes incredibly interesting, which is when Frank Leslie dies, and suddenly it all falls apart. Absolutely everything. The money, the business, her reputation. She's sued by his sons because he left everything, it turns out to be debts in the will. And she's forced to live in this garret, right? She's living in a slum, in a garret, fighting in the courts to get the inheritance back. And I think this is like the core of the book, isn't it? Because it's really when you see a woman with her back against the wall and everyone has deserted her, and all she has now is her inner strength and wits. And what happens?
You have to admire her flint, her drive, and her resilience. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary that she went through an entire year living in this cold water flat with a communal toilet. We won't go into details, but it was a gruesome, hideous year, the coldest winter in New York, and she suffered terribly and worked 12-hour days trying to deal with this empire that had fallen apart. Her husband was an overreacher, and he kept buying and buying and buying, and there was bloated inventory, debts. He was a big spendaholic. The whole place was a complete wreck, and it was in the hands of receivers, these four jackals who wanted to get the empire away from Miriam. And they gave her 10 days to come up with $50,000, or else it wasn't hers anymore. And she said, oh, I wish I had a woman to help me. And it turns out a little boy who she'd been kind to at the Frank Leslie publishing company lived next door to a widow of a man who had made money selling rotten goods to the Confederates or something horrible. And she lent her the money in exchange for her jewelry. And so Miriam paid back these 5 men, but then she was still left with an empire that was in a shambles. And the way she pulled it up from destitution was just a miracle. She said, I did what my husband would have done. When Garfield was assassinated, he was assassinated on a Saturday morning at, I think, 9 o'clock. By 10 o'clock, she had her illustrators on the train to Washington. They came back with tons of illustrations, and she spent the entire weekend, she fed them champagne and sandwiches, and they stayed in the office until Sunday night, and she got the first fully illustrated account of the Garfield assassination. And then she put horses on it. She rode that story until he died and had 11 covers, as opposed to Harper's, which only had 6. And recouped the money. There was another episode, too, where she sent 30,000 copies of Garfield's Washington funeral to Cleveland, and also made a fortune on that. But at the end, she had pulled the entire company up and was posting a profit. So it's an extraordinary story. And after that, she was called the Queen of Park Place, the Empress of Journalism. She was now a media giant at that point. And
it's really impressive. I mean,
it was an incredible story. Yeah, an army of one, and she did this.
So I think, so on that note, now we're talking about the Empresses of Journalism. Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. I'm now going to talk to a current Empress.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story.
It is amazing. It's tailor-made
too.
for the big
I can't wait
screen.
to see the TV series.
Yeah.
Whenever that is.
It's got to happen. And it's a great privilege for me to be sitting here since Tina edited my first cover story for Newsweek. And so I got to know her both as a human being, as an editor, and to see her at work, crafting writers, making us all better. And this, I think, is what separates Tina from most other editors today, is that she is both a writer and an editor, and she loves journalism and the craft of writing. And I believe that she's had more influence and more of an impact on late 20th and early 21st century journalism than any other individual that I can think of. So it's rather fantastic to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Paul.
No, it's a great pleasure. And I love talking to you about the Palace Papers because I think all of us love human drama. I mean, we're hardwired to love stories and narratives, and my God, are there stories in this book. But I want to focus, first of all, on why you called it the Palace Papers, because that's a really important point, that it's not just the royal family. The palace is a thing. And if you could just lay it out for all of us about the difference between the households, the courtiers, the family themselves, the institution, what it is, because it's only when you start to realize, the vast, terrifying labyrinth that is the palace.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that, the palace, Buckingham Palace, is the ultimate deep state, right? I mean, you have, scheming courtiers, sort of moldering, scheming, just places just crawling with intrigue. You also, of course, have the principals themselves and their kind of feuding communications teams, because each of the households wants their principal to be the star of the show. And my book begins at the end of the Diana era. Diana has died, and Diana herself, of course, when she was alive, there was the ultimate sort of inter-palace warfare, because there was Diana's staff versus Charles's staff and the Queen's staff, and they all hated each other. sort of briefed against each other. And it begins, with how the Queen is, the monarchy itself has been so shaken by the comet, the scorched earth, if you like, of the Diana era. They have to try to get the show back on the road and win back, essentially, the equilibrium of the monarchy, which involves not just themselves, but of course all their internecine households. So you have Prince Charles at that time, who was feeling wounded by the fact that he'd been always kind of cast as the sort of the villain in the Diana story, and was deeply unpopular, and trying to bring up Camilla, who was then his mistress, to the point that he might be able to marry her. You had the sort of the relics of the angry Diana people. You had the Queen's staff, who were really trying to kind of just quieten the whole kind of dramas that had been going on. So it was a very, very sort of turbulent time. So the canvas of the book is getting over the Diana death, and then what the Queen went through during that time. She went through the death of her mother, and she went through the death of her sister, Princess Margaret. And she was very anxious until her Golden Jubilee in 2002 that she would not be fully embraced by the public again. It had been a very rattling experience for the Queen to have that period where the sort of, as it were, the mob turned against her after Diana died. She managed to quieten it down when she came out and spoke finally, before Diana's funeral. But she left her feeling very rattled. And indeed, her own courtiers, who I spoke to about that era, called it the revolution. I mean, they found it a very rattling time, and everybody knew they had to sort of rethink how they were doing things after Diana died. So the Queen goes through this drama, but she actually also, in her inimitable way, it's also the time when she kind of emerges too, because for the first time, her mother was always a hugely difficult figure in her life. I mean, one of the things that I'm surprised about in The Crown is that actually they don't really do the Queen Mother's influence. And the Queen Mother was a powerful force in the Queen's life, because she was widowed at the age of, 56. Was it 52 or 56?
Yeah.
George VI died much before his time was supposed to be ended, and so the Queen Mother was a powerful sort of matriarch, and she did not want to be sort of shoved back into the shadows while her 25-year-old Queen Elizabeth, her daughter, took over the throne. Much though she loved her daughter, she didn't really feel that Elizabeth had what it took. I mean, she thought that Elizabeth was, she was shy, she didn't have her star power, essentially. So there was always this kind of tension of the Queen Mother feeling like she was bigger star and she'd been shunted into the shadows. And Princess Margaret, who of course was the more exciting of the sisters, so always out being more glamorous, always out, sort of being the one everyone was interested in. And then of course there was Diana then, who came along and was the ultimate comet. So for a long time the Queen had been sort of never quite come into her powers. So by the time her Jubilee comes along in 2002, it was her Golden Jubilee, she was feeling unsure at that time, and when the public really embraced her at that moment, that was the point where she sort of suddenly realized it was like, the evolution of Regina at last. I mean, she was in her 60s, mother had gone, sister had gone, and Diana had gone, and the Queen was able to sort of come out and really get her mojo back. So some of the book is about how the Queen did that. And then, of course, Charles had to battle with the public's perception to get Camilla accepted. And
so this is what I want to ask you about, because what comes across in the book so wonderfully is that sometimes when you're watching the royal family, it's a cross between a Greek tragedy and a French farce, and, and going on simultaneously. And I wondered, though, whether there were various members of the royal family that you were kind of personally rooting for as you uncovered these various stories. And if that's the case, who were they? But did you then have to restrain yourself because you're a reporter, so you can't show favoritism? So, but I sometimes felt that you had a kind of sneaking admiration for one over the other.
Well, I became very fond of Camilla in the writing of this book, because when you understand what sort of Camilla went through to get where she is a really fascinating story with like Mrs. Leslie-like sort of twists and turns. I mean, she's this, comes from this fabulous family. I mean, the Shand family were a very charming, enormously charming squirearchy family, from Sussex. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, was a master of the hunt, and they were a very distinguished family. Her brother, Mark, was one of the great playboy, great-looking sort of travel adventurer figures in London. Her sister's a society decorator. So the Shands were always this very glamorous family. They were known as the sexy Shands. And she captured Charles, very early on. I mean, Charles fell madly in love with her very early on. But Camilla is, in truth, people think, she was always kind of mourning to get married to Prince Charles. She was not like that at all. The love of Camilla's life, really, was her husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, who was this fabulous cad. I mean, he really was a cad. He had girlfriends all over town. He was absolutely faithless, tremendous horseman. And they had this marriage where, for a long time, Camilla was always trying to figure out, like, who the hell Andrew was with during the weeks. And it was a bruising marriage, although they're actually still very good friends, the two of them. Andrew also had a big flaming romance with Princess Anne. I mean, there was no one that Andrew hadn't had a big flaming romance with. So at a certain point, she really kind of turned back to Charles, who had always held a candle for her and always regretted that he hadn't been able to marry her, because she was considered, he would like to have married her, but she was considered just not up there enough. She was well born, but she wasn't of the standard that they felt in the royal family he should marry. They wanted him to marry either a princess. For a long time, it was considered he might marry Princess Mary Astrid of, the Netherlands or somewhere very dull. And of course, then along comes, Diana, and Diana was basically picked because trying to find a virgin of Charles's age, in the 1970s, I mean, it was like a search for the Loch Ness Monster, it really was. So the Queen Mother eyes the lovely Spencer girl, at a wedding and thinks that she's perfect. She has this, rose-colored complexion, and she's 19, and the Spencers were marvelously aristocratic, and her father had been an equerry of the Queen's, and it all, on paper, it was always so fantastic. If anyone had really looked closely at the Spencers, they might have had a second thoughts, because the Spencers were a very turbulent family, always were choleric, hot-headed, troublemakers, always essentially over-mighty courtiers, essentially, in their own period. So that was the Spencers. But when Charles kind of turned to Camilla again, I mean, Camilla was feeling wounded really by her husband's caprices. And essentially, really, I think, to be honest, at that time, I think that she saw Charles in a way as a sort of slight power play with her husband. I mean, she was very fond indeed of Prince Charles, but he also was great counterbalance to Andrew's infidelities and kept Andrew on his toes. So that went on for a long time until, unfortunately, and it was a terrible thing for her, was when this ham radio person, played this disastrous tape which you'll all see on The Crown, because I think they're doing it. Who amongst us could have our sort of, sexy conversations with our lovers or husbands played, for the nation? I mean, it was the most embarrassing conversation anyone could have heard. And of course, then Diana comes out with, the Andrew Morton book, where she talks about Camilla as the real problem in their marriage. Suddenly, Camilla is, having gone from being the sort of undercover mistress with a slightly glamorous sort of frisson about her, suddenly she's sort of a pariah. I mean, she is absolutely trashed. I mean, there's no other word for it. She is utterly and totally trashed. I mean, she had to essentially go undercover and sort of hide for 2 years. She never complained about it. She never made a song and dance or cried or was miserable or talked about it publicly. But she really was trashed. And she had to stay in her own house and sort of hide from the press. I mean, there's a really good photograph of that time of her sort of arriving at her house in Wiltshire, with a sort of headscarf tied around her head, looking absolutely sort of bereft, and she's alone and she looks just miserable, Because unlike Charles, who had a carapace of communications people and the palace and his stature, Camilla was just like a woman living in a house in Wiltshire, so she had no protection from all of this.
And her children, too.
And her children. Her children were mocked at school. Her children were miserable. It was a terrible, terrible time for her. But she got through it. And when Diana died, of course, Charles was divorced at that point, and there was a hope that, she could gradually come out of the shadows. But of course, when Diana died, she was again, pariah number one. She was the evil person who'd been, the other woman in the relationship who Charles couldn't forsake. And once again, she was sort of kicked back into the shadows. She had to go and hide again for like another year or two.
I mean, at that point, my understanding is she was almost in danger. I mean,
she was. She really was. I mean, and yet, nonetheless, she got through it with sort of stoicism and humor. And Charles then goes on the television with the Dimbleby interview, and also admits to having been unfaithful with Camilla. At which point, her husband. I mean, you'd actually ask, well, you would think that the famous, Tampax tape might have been enough to have him divorce his wife. Apparently not. The thing that made him divorce his wife, was hearing Prince Charles basically say he'd been unfaithful. Because in that, the only thing you can't be in that realm of society is honest, right? I mean, you can't. You can deny it, and that's fine. But if one party goes on television and says, "I did it," that's it. That's the so. Andrew then divorces her, and that was a very perilous time for Camilla. She actually had a difficult financial time. She was suddenly a divorcee alone, with the press after her. It was a very difficult time indeed, but once again, she managed to get through that so that finally, on May the 6th, she will be crowned queen.
But wait. You've jumped ahead here because...
Well, I'm doing because I'm aware of time, so I thought we had to fast
we have
forward.
time. No, because the main thing is, how did she convince the Queen to forgive her and like her? Because the Queen referred to as that woman.
No, the Queen was absolutely, she wouldn't even receive Camilla for years and years. She wouldn't receive Camilla, and basically, but what Camilla did was she played the long game, like the Queen does. She didn't push. She wasn't impatient. She knew that ultimately it was just about playing the long game, and she just was, she didn't do television interviews, she didn't do any press interviews, she never spoke about it, she just was in the background, and gradually, as time went by, Charles's communications secretary, the very talented Mark Bolan, he organized strategic moments when Camilla could be seen and when gradually she should come out. And finally it got to the point where the Queen herself said, enough, this has got to be cleaned up. We're never going to be able to get to the next phase if you don't marry her. And she actually said to Charles, it's time to marry her.
So the Queen, what you haven't said, which I think we're all dying to know though, is who was the person that the Queen depended on and used the most to have this glorious resurrection after Diana's death, and to plot the royal family's reinvention as a popular monarchy? Who was it?
Well, Prince Philip was enormously important. He was always her sounding board and her consigliere. Really, he was the most important person in her life. She had a series of very intelligent private secretaries, first Robin Janvrin, Robert Fellows, and then particularly talented a man called Sir Christopher Geit, who she had for 10 years, who was really very intelligent and had great strategic sense. And I would say that Christopher Geit was probably her most influential private secretary, who eventually got fired in a palace coup because he became too powerful as far as Charles was concerned. And Andrew also hated Christopher Geit because Christopher Geit conspired, as Andrew saw it, with the Foreign Office to get him fired as England's trade secretary. I mean, it didn't take much conspiring because Andrew was such a giant oaf, Everybody wanted Andrew out, and Christopher Geit very elegantly made sure it happened. So, and once Christopher Geit left the palace, I would say everything started to go wrong again, because a lot of people feel that if Christopher Geit had been there, the Megxit thing would have been handled very differently, the Andrew thing would have been handled very differently. Christopher Geit was a great loss to the palace, and there are many who still feel that.
Well, so Prince Andrew feels that one could just class that under a kind of failure of intellect. But with the exit of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to California, that feels like a much larger failure, which obviously you attribute to a kind of breakdown in the palace machinery. But what do you think went wrong there? Because that's probably the biggest disaster that the family has suffered in the last few years.
Well, unfortunately, it was a series of things that went wrong. I mean, Prince Harry was the most popular person in the royal family after the Queen by around about 2012. Things had went very well for the royals. I mean, after the Diana debacle, Queen gets back her mojo, and then there was this extremely good stretch from 2009 through the Olympics of 2012. It included the Queen's amazingly successful tour of Ireland, and the marriage of William and Kate were enormously successful and popular, and Harry going to Afghanistan, serving in the army, really showing a lot of courage, and he was adored at that phase. But unfortunately, he should never really have left the army, because after 10 years, he comes out of the army, and it's really only then that he confronts the sheer sort of, the reality of being the number two after William. In the army, he was cosseted essentially by a separate culture, a strategy, a hierarchy, his own achievements. He was extremely successful and good in the army. Comes home, and now it's like, well, what am I going to do now? He feels like the spare, which is what he's called his book, which is coming out soon. And he can't accept it, really, because, Diana had raised her boys to be the same, which was great, except it wasn't, because they're not the same. And he had to confront the fact suddenly that he wasn't, and he got very angry and unhappy, Harry, long before he met Meghan, with what he felt was, William clearly having emerged, having the better assignments, the better portfolios, the better charities. He wanted a better portfolio, Harry, and there were a lot of rows with William and with William's staff and with Charles and all of them about what Harry felt was he wasn't being deployed in the way that he wanted to be deployed. But frankly, it was also unrealistic. He was number two. He wasn't going to get the best gigs. There was Charles, he had to get what he wanted, William had to get what he wanted, and then whatever was left would go to Harry. And he did not like that. So when he met Meghan, he was vulnerable to that sort of unhappiness. He has spoken often about being very unhappy. He had all kinds of mental problems about all this, and was deeply unhappy. Along comes Meghan, who essentially sort of validates those feelings for him and says, yes, you are a star. You're a bigger star than they're telling you you are. You can do more. You should be bigger. You should be. And that essentially, they become almost like a secret society of two, of anger about the situation essentially that Harry's been born into. And many of the people I spoke to at the palace sort of said that actually the Queen would have been, she kind of knew that Harry was going to leave at some point. They all knew, she said, that at some point Harry was so miserable he'd probably want to leave. But nobody thought he would leave in the way that he left, and with quite the same kind of levels of anger and drama and sort of explosive consequences. It was thought that perhaps a role could be carved out for Harry where he would have, like other members of the royal family have done, sort of a step-back role, perhaps, go and live in the country. They all thought that he might want to go to Africa. He'd always wanted to go to Africa. Nobody for a million years thought this person who was obsessed with having no privacy and hated the press as much as he did would actually choose to then have a life of total celebrity and non-stop interviews and press all the time. I mean, that's what has been a massive, massive blow to everybody.
And it ties into the title, The Palace Papers, because suddenly all of the apparati of the palace fell and broke, and the result, in a way, is Megxit and Harry's departure.
Well, it is. I mean, Harry, of course, is very naive, because one of the things that really became clear to me writing this book was that the Queen was brilliant in a way and she was really brilliant at being both a woman of family and the sovereign. And it's a very difficult role if you're the monarch, because you are both. I mean, the monarchy is a 1,000-year-old institution, but it's actually constructed on the frail shoulders of very fallible people. I mean, it's a thing, but there's also people inside it. And it only works if the people accept that trade-off, as it were, of the cage. And so Harry, one of them said to me, the courtiers said to me, that the family always know, are they going to see the Queen as mummy or granny? Fine, everything's very cozy, feeding the dogs, chat, 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 everything's lovely. Or are they going to see the Queen as the sovereign? If they're going to see the Queen with anything that pertains to the monarchy or the comportment or, you know, the roles or anything of that kind, they're going to find themselves at a long table, you know, with private secretaries, with taking notes. And it's incredibly formal, and the Queen will sit at the head of the table, and it's like, you know, a board meeting. So when Harry said on Oprah, you know, that he had gone away to Canada and then he was going to come back to England just after Christmas of 2020 and see the Queen had said she wanted him to go to tea at Sandringham to see him. But then, says Harry, I landed at the airport and suddenly got a message, no, the Queen's diary is full, she can't see you for another 4 weeks. Okay. And he blamed her private secretaries. Well, I mean, frankly, it's called CEO deniability, right? I mean, of course her private secretaries and she are on the same page. Of course the private secretary consults her, or had it not occurred to Harry that having had tea with his grandmother set up, his grandmother said to her private secretary, do you think I should see Harry? I mean, what's he coming to see me about? Well, ma'am, I think he's coming to see you, really, to talk about it. I was like, oh, well, do just tell him I'm busy, will you? I mean, of course it works like that, you know? And the Queen was not this agentless person who has this palace people around her telling her things. No. She was always, she did like to be guided, and she did listen to her private secretaries closely. But in the end, the thing that was great about the Queen was she always knew what she didn't want to do. She didn't always know what she did want to do, but she always knew what she didn't want to do.
So briefly, what do you think, before we just have the two of you talking, what do you think is going to save the monarchy going forward?
Well, I think the monarchy is doing very well at the moment, actually. I mean, it's the British political system that's in disarray. I mean, I do think it's not an accident that the Queen's last act in life was to sort of meet Liz Truss and decide that perhaps it was time to leave the scene. But no, I mean, I think that you know what was fabulous and fascinating about the death of the Queen. Well, first of all, everything was so brilliant as always with the Queen. You know, she always wanted to die in Scotland because that was her most private of homes, but also she. Balmoral, you know, for her, to die in Scotland meant that it was her last act of soft power, essentially, because, you know, there is the question of a possible another referendum where Scotland might leave the Union, which to the Queen was like a dagger to the heart. That was the thing she cared the most about. And by dying in Scotland, you know, she reminded everybody there, all the Scots, that Scotland was at the heart of the Union, not a sort of peripheral to the Union. That, you know, the slow progress of her coffin through the, you know, to St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh and lying in state first in Scotland, the Scottish standard on her coffin. It was such a hugely emotional thing for the Scots with regard to the monarchy, and that was brilliant. That happened, as she had always wished it would happen. And then, of course, the way the funeral was handled was so flawless and so incredible that people the world over were just gobsmacked at how every single bit of the ceremonial, so steeped in emotional, I mean, it was not sort of, you know, mummery and flummery of...
Well, also you reported on it. You did a sterling job, 10 days, on almost 24 hours a day. Well, it was quite a thing to watch.
Well, but it was such a pleasure to see this extraordinary historical transition happening. You know, because it's once in a century. You know.
So you think that the funeral actually, well, sad though it was a rather good marker for how the future.
I think the funeral reasserted what monarchy means, because it showed that the history was so steeped in tradition and the 5-mile queues of the British public in without any incidents or without any, like, just quiet, respectful lines after line, mile after mile, wanting to thank the Queen for her service. And Charles stepping up and doing an amazing job, really, a very dignified, he was a statesman. You know, he had a reception at Buckingham Palace where you had all of these, you know, prime ministers and presidents literally kind of like crawling on their hands and knees to get on that bus, you know, to go to that funeral. I mean, who else could have made presidents and kings, queens, and, I mean, get on a bus and I mean, you know, I mean, it was absolutely amazing. There's nobody in politics that could have pulled that off. And it reminded people just how the monarchy, by being sort of over the political system, actually creates a great focus of unity, which in some ways I think some other countries might be sort of envious of. I mean, you know, because partisan politics is so rancorous.
Let's hope they don't squander it. But you said something quite interesting, though.
They could squander it, because they often do.
Well, they often do. So the thing
Charles is very good at that.
Well, we now have a king. We have who's a man. William is a man, obviously, and the next line is also a man. So we're going to, if we keeps on going, we're going to have 3 kings. So the era of women leaders, at least in the UK, the monarchy is over. So Betsy, I just want to ask you, do you feel that we are on a cliff towards greater female empowerment right now, or do you think we're on a cliff towards possibly going back the other way?
Oh, I feel that there's, unfortunately, a real erosion of female rights right now. It's quite alarming. I mean, the loss of reproductive rights, the rise of domestic violence, the rise of rape, all of that. But to get back to the Queen, what interested me was the adulation for a 19th century version of the true woman. The woman who is self-sacrificial, the woman who is a person devoted to duty, obedience, decorum. This is not a role model for the future, I don't think. It's not good for women to be raised to believe that they need to repress their individual growth to serve other people, to conform, to well, she said, I obey, obey at the marriage ceremony. This was all part, or to be an embodiment, or to feel that a woman should be the personification of goodness and should be a safe harbor for a man in a turbulent world. And symbolically, that's really, don't you think, what Queen Elizabeth was? She was a shelter, a harbor for a country that was feeling in a state of tremendous turmoil and the demise of empire and all of those things. And here she was, a symbol of that. But that is a model right out of Miriam's generation, but not a model for the future, I don't think.
I don't agree. I think the Queen was a very sort of self-fulfilled woman, as a matter of fact. I mean, I think she...
But I think what Betsy's talking about is the public-private persona. So even if in private she could be self-fulfilled, it is an interesting proposition that Betsy's saying, which is that is it possible today for a woman of that kind of stature and in the public to be both her private self and her private self in public, and for that to be the same? Or does she have to have a public persona that's
I think that's
forced on her?
It's more of a struggle for women than it is for men, in the sense that, as you saw with Theresa May, she was so sort of she was so cautious, and the same with Hillary, the desire to kind of an unsureness about how her public role should be played, which I do think is more generational. I mean, there are other women leaders who I don't feel that about, actually. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, the leader in Scotland, is I find that she is not, sort of crouched in that sort of carapace of caution that you saw with Theresa May, and in some ways the Queen. But I think the Queen's different, because the Queen, she's the sovereign, so therefore, her role was to be the whole idea of the sort of the emblematic sort of sacral royal family that have to be perfect. It wasn't just the Queen had to be perfect. It was so was everybody else in her family, supposedly. Like her father had to be that as well. It's harder for Charles now because we know too much about him.
Well, that is very... Yes, I mean, sadly we do. So the thing is...
After that phone call, it's hard to have mystique.
Well, that is very true. And who knows, it may be going forward that we will ultimately be able to find a sweet spot where women can be themselves both at home and outside, at work, and it all comes together. Unfortunately, we have now reached the end of our allotted time. Although I feel that we could have, there was much more to mine on this, but I want to thank Betsy Prioleau and Tina Brown. Thank you very much for a really fascinating conversation for both of you.
Talk about that forever.